He's a rabbit with a habit. He's skinny but they call him Fat Rabbit. He's a rabbit and there you have it. If he offers you a drink you better grab it.
Chapter 2. Vigilantes. "I don't know what you expect me to do about it," moaned Fat Rabbit as he poured himself another glass of Fitou. The friends had retreated to the shade of Fat Rabbit's kitchen and were seated haphazardly around the large oak table that took up most of the room. For the past hour it had been filled with the sounds of weeping, wailing, sobbing, and general despair from many of the animals, especially those in possession of hooves at the end of their legs. Even Roger, after some suitably simple and gentle explanations from Floozy, had realized that being cold was not something to be celebrated, even if it was going to be done by the Queen. "There must be something you can do," pleaded Treacle, who was desperately trying to comfort Melissa the pig with a barely adequately sized tissue. "Yeah, man," added Floozy, who was sitting next to Maisie the cow and had decided that the end of the tablecloth was going to be more effective at stemming the stream of tears and snuffles from the distraught bovine. "After all, you're always telling us how clever you are, and how there's always a solution to every problem." Archibald neighed loudly in agreement. He was standing outside, but had stuck his great heavy head through the kitchen window to join in the discussion. "Here, here, young lady. A chap doesn't survive the Blitz just to be killed by a group of fascist state minions. Not cricket, I say. Not cricket at all." Fat Rabbit sighed and pondered for a moment whether Archibald had actually been anywhere near the Blitz, given that the farm was about as far from anywhere as you could possibly get, even if you walked all afternoon. The wailing and weeping was beginning to give him a headache, and he longed for the peace and quiet of the shade of his favourite tree, or perhaps the billiard room. "But that is precisely the buggering point," he exclaimed in exasperation. "We're dealing with the state here, the government, the powers that be, and we are, like it or not, the powerless buggers that be. And can you please try and stop all the wailing? Anyone would think you were remembering Zion." "So says the great revolutionary leader. First chance he gets to take 'em on, and he's given up without a shot being fired." Like all cats, Plato was primarily interested only in himself, and viewed the rest of the world as something created solely for his own pleasure and enjoyment. However, like all cats, he also had a soft spot in his hard exterior of nonchalance and self-interest, and on this occasion he felt some sympathy for his hoofed compatriots. More importantly, he also never liked to miss an opportunity to extract the urine from Fat Rabbit. There was a great wailing of agreement, and Roger brayed loudly, "I'm too young to be called." Most pitiful it was to see. Fat Rabbit stood up and banged his glass hard down on the table, so hard in fact that the stem snapped clean away. "Enough!" he continued as his headache began to reach throbbing proportions. "There is nothing I can do. I wish there was. Dreadful though it is, these circumstances are beyond my control. Any bugger can see that. Kegane! These are the slings and arrows and pointy sticks of outrageous fortune that beset us all from time to time. Memento mori, comrades, memento mori. Obladi, oblada! Now can we please have some quiet?" With that, he sat back down and busied himself with trying to get the cellophane off his last pack of Marlborough, which, as you may appreciate, is no easy task if evolution has forgotten to bless you with an opposable thumb. There was a brief moment of silence following Fat Rabbit's outburst. Then Floozy slowly stood up. Unlike Fat Rabbit, Flues had travelled the world somewhat, including undertaking a hazardous trip to that mountain kingdom where absolute monarchy had recently gone out of fashion to be replaced by a novel form of socialism. She had also been to Pockington. As such, behind her laid-back attitude and mirrored shades, a vein of resolute determination ran through her being to be called on in times of crisis. In a steady, sober, and uncharacteristically serious tone, Floozy addressed her friends. First, they came for the chickens, but I was not a chicken and so did not speak out. Then they came for the water voles, but I was not a water vole and so did not speak out. Then they came for the TV, but as I don't watch TV, I did not speak out. And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak out for me. That was deep, whispered Melissa to Treacle, who nodded in agreement and wondered at her friend's newly revealed oratory skills. But Flues wasn't finished yet. Very slowly and very deliberately, she raised her mirrored shades and placed them on top of her head. There were gasps of astonishment and mild consternation from all the animals. Flusy, you've got eyes! Exclaimed Roger, his own eyes widening like a collapsing pot on a potter's wheel. Not once, not ever, not even in the combined memories of all the inhabitants of Fat Rabbit's farm was there a recollection of any time that Floozy had removed her shades. Even Fat Rabbit's jaw dropped, and his cigarette fell from his mouth to the table, where it proceeded to burn another hole in the tablecloth. Floozy's eyes were amazing. They were the sort of eyes that poets write verse after wandering verse about without ever conveying anything much of substance at all. They were eyes that seemed to burn right through you, to the very depths of your being. Eyes that you couldn't look at for long without getting a sort of giddy feeling in your head and the distinct impression that at any moment you might turn to stone or melt to become an embarrassing and difficult to clean up puddle on the floor. If our leaders fail to lead, she continued, giving each animal in turn a dose of ocular laudanum, if our actors fail to act, if our rabbit can do nothing but rabbit, then, my friends, the people must take matters into their own hands. Fat Rabbit is not the only rabbit around here with a kitchen table. To the mill, my friends, once more to the mill. So saying, and much to the relief of everyone, she placed her shades back over her eyes, took Maisie by the hoof and strode purposefully out of the door. One by one, or in twos, the rest of the animals followed, their wails of moments before reduced to occasional sobs and the odd hiccup. As Treacle reached the door, she looked back at Fat Rabbit. I'm very disappointed in you, she said softly, and then turned and followed the rest of her friends. Only Fat Rabbit and Plato remained in the now silent kitchen. Well, bugger me, exclaimed Fat Rabbit, reclaiming his cigarette and patting out the tablecloth that had begun to smoulder worryingly. That's done it now, Rabbit, purred Plato. A coup d'etat. Fat Rabbit sighed. So much for the mutually beneficial cooperative. The following morning found Fat Rabbit in a very grumpy mood. A frightfully grumpy mood indeed. The sort of spiky, tetchy, prickly mood that you might be in if the numbers that you used every week on the lottery bounced merrily out of the machine just as you realised you had forgotten, for the first time ever, to buy a ticket. The reason for Fat Rabbit's bad fettle was twofold. To begin with, he hadn't had much sleep. As usual, he'd staggered upstairs at some time past the witching hour, managed to find his bed, and collapsed in a heap, leaving a half-empty glass of Fitou on his bedside table. He'd not even begun to start dreaming when he was woken by the sound of music and raucous, high-spirited, discordant singing. At first he thought he must have fallen asleep at a party, but once he'd roused himself enough to realise he was tangled in his own quilt cover, he quickly ascertained that he wasn't at a party, and that the singing wasn't part of some strange nightmare. Turning his ears, first this way and then that, he concluded that the noise was coming from outside, in the direction of the pond. Grumbling profusely, he stumbled out of bed, grabbed the glass of Fitou, and headed over to the window. There in the darkness, somewhere towards the pond, Fat Rabbit could see a campfire blazing, and many little lights swaying gently this way and that. The shadows that passed occasionally between the fire and his window assured him that it was his friends who were gathered together, and not a band of the revelling fairies from Dodgy Tenor Wood, who were known for their impromptu parties at this time of year. Anyway, the fairies usually sang in tune. He lifted up the sash window, and the strains of a song accompanied by a badly tuned guitar assaulted his sleepy ears. We shall not be moved. Oh, we shall not be moved, sang the protesting animals, over and over and over again. Sticking his head out into the night, and resisting a sudden urge to shout, "John, John, the grey goose is gone!" Fat Rabbit instead hollered at the top of his voice, "What in bugger's name is going on?" The singing and music rapidly petered out, apart from one particularly flat voice that was instantly recognisable as Roger's, that carried on for a few moments longer before some unknown assailant elbowed him in the ribs and whispered, "Shh!" "We're holding a vigil, man!" Floozy shouted back at Fat Rabbit. "A what?" asked Fat Rabbit incredulously. "A vigil," repeated Melissa, "to prevent this unnecessary violence against ungulates. We shall not be moved." Fat Rabbit waited for the various cheers and excited candle waving to die down before shouting back across the velvety night, "No one's wanting to move you, you daft buggers. They're wanting to kill you." "We ain't not gonna let them do neither," brayed back Roger. For a moment, Fat Rabbit thought about unpacking his friend's triple negative, but decided he was probably wasting his time. Instead, he simply replied angrily, "Well, can't you go and vigilate somewhere else?" "No!" shouted the masked vigilantes. "Bugger," said Fat Rabbit, slamming shut the window and stomping back to his bed. For the next few hours, the singing continued unabated, as Floozy ran through her entire repertoire of protest songs several times. No matter how many pillows he placed over his head, Fat Rabbit could still hear the increasingly hoarse voices pounding out their protest with gusto. Finally, just before the night began to give way to the growing light of the sun, and just as Fat Rabbit was about to give up on trying to get any sleep, the sky was filled with the sound of thunder, and a heavy rain began to fall from the sky. Within moments, the singing stopped, as the vigil holders scattered to seek shelter from the deluge. "That's pissed on their bonfire," muttered Fat Rabbit, as he finally drifted off into a sleep full of dreams of aliens, wailing, and endless empty bottles of Fitou. Sadly for Fat Rabbit, his dreams continued to take a turn towards the surreal, and he soon awoke with a start from a dream where he had found himself surrounded by 5-foot-high empty bottles singing, "We shall not be moved." "Bugger," he thought to himself as he rubbed his eyes and realised that the morning had arrived and there was little point in trying to get back to sleep. Outside his window, the thunderstorm had given way to a drab, rainy day that promised to do little to help anyone's mood of despondency and despair. Hopping out of bed, our hero grabbed his few remaining Marlborough and headed down to the kitchen in a foul grump. Now, the second reason for Fat Rabbit's bad mood this morning had nothing to do with the rain, the singing, the strange dreams, or the lack of sleep they had all contributed to. The fact was, Fat Rabbit really didn't like falling out with his friends. If truth be told, Fat Rabbit didn't like conflict of any sort, and would often go to great lengths to avoid situations that had even the smallest potential to result in disagreement or discord. The problem with this was that his initial avoidance very often resulted in making matters worse, and leading to a real humdinger of a row that left everyone in a far greater huff than was ever necessary. Plato was curled up asleep on the Arga when Fat Rabbit entered the kitchen, as sure a sign as anything that it was raining outside. Filling the kettle, Fat Rabbit then placed it on the stove and tapped his foot impatiently as the water slowly heated up. Mornings were another thing that Fat Rabbit wasn't particularly enamoured of. As far as he was concerned, whilst God may well have created the day and the night, the devil most definitely had a hand in the invention of mornings. The only consolation for mornings was coffee, something that Fat Rabbit was very fond of indeed, almost as much as he was fond of Fitou and cigarettes. He'd often wondered whether there was something inherently addictive about things beginning with the letter C, though he had never had a serious cornflake habit. On the other hand, he was partial to chips. Fat Rabbit was just starting his second mug of coffee when the door to the kitchen opened and in walked a very bedraggled-looking donkey. "Morning, Roger," said Fat Rabbit in the cheeriest voice he could muster. He had decided that the best approach to the day was going to be to pretend that everything was normal and yesterday simply hadn't happened. "I'm not talking to you," replied Roger rather sternly. "Oh," said Fat Rabbit, "why ever not?" "Because you should be coming up with a masterly plan to save us from being called by the Queen, rather than sitting here drinking coffee." Fat Rabbit sighed. It was becoming obvious that his plan to pretend yesterday hadn't happened would probably need some rethinking. "I see. So how long are you intending on not talking to me?" he asked. "As long as it takes," replied his friend. "And as long as you remain so obsolete." "I think you mean obstinate," corrected Fat Rabbit, though he had to admit he did feel a little obsolete being all alone in his kitchen whilst plans were being made by the other animals. "That too," continued Roger. "It may take hours or days or weeks or months, but I am determined not to talk to you until you change your mind." "It's hardly likely to last weeks, you daft bugger," said Fat Rabbit. "You're getting cold tomorrow, though granted that will certainly put us on a not-talking footing." Roger opened his mouth as if to reply, but no words came. Instead, his lip trembled, his ears drooped, and a solitary large tear rolled from his dark donkey eyes. With a final sad look at his friend, he turned on his hoof and walked sadly and slowly out of the kitchen and away across the courtyard. "Bugger," said Fat Rabbit. "Nice one, Rabbit," purred Plato sleepily from the Arga.
He's a rabbit with a habit. He's skinny but they call him Fat Rabbit. He's a rabbit and there you have it.